because I'm quite confident that they will segue beautifully, and I'm sure they're going to. And
can you come a little closer to the microphone?
Yep, okay. I need to also be able to press the right button at the time, so this is going to require a lot of coordination. So basically what I'm talking about is moving on from Richard's speaking about very broad IT movement, is the idea of human futures compared with what I call technotopian futures. So from an overview, what I call technotopian advancement, now I'm talking about advancement of human beings, so-called advancement of human beings. I'm not trying to tackle the whole sort of internet. I'm looking at basically the movement to technologically, biologically, genetically enhance human beings. So I'm having a bit of a problem here because I can't quite read my screen here. Is it possible to get the screen in a bigger format on here? Because it's otherwise I have to turn around and read off here, off there. Can that go onto a big format? Like a slideshow format? That's better. Now I can see it. Okay. So just briefly as an overview. So there's a lot of research and a lot of research dollars being spent on these high-tech approaches to so-called human advancement. Artificial intelligence, robots, artificial superintelligence, machines smarter than humans, and all kinds of human enhancement through technology, biology, and genetic manipulation. Overview of what I mean by human advancement. Abraham Maslow writing in 1971 about the farther reaches of human nature. And there's a lot of research that's been going on in that time and previously about ways of human beings advancing humanity without the use of technology. There's 40 years of psychology research on higher reasoning. There's lots and lots of cultural history research by many people on the evolution of human culture and consciousness. And there's some very interesting research on superhuman powers not aided by technology. So the first section of this presentation is talking about transhumanism, posthumanism, Superman from a technotopian futures view. Transhumanism as we know it today, the high-tech transhumanism, talks about cyborgs, human-machine interface. Posthumanism, meaning enhanced superhumans technologically. The singularity idea, which is human functioning technologically advancing exponentially until there's some kind of convergence, supposedly, between humans and technology. And then there's new terms emerging like Elon Musk's neural lace, where we merge the human brain with AI. So, but actually, although they get a lot of media coverage and a lot of research dollars, they're still actually all science fiction at this stage. Cyborg. I don't know if any of you have... Who's heard of Neil Harbisson? Yeah, a few of you. He's a Catalan-raised, British-born contemporary artist and cyborg activist. He's actually known for having an antenna. That's an antenna on his head. It's an implant into his brain, which has wired him up to sort of hypersensitive. Basically, he has a higher sensitivity for colours and certain sounds and so on. And he's been recognised, I think, by the Catalan government as being a cyborg on his passport, not a human being. And he's founded the Cyborg Foundation. Very interesting. I want to raise I'm just going to say a few challenging things and not talk too much about them and leave them for you to think about and we can talk about later. I suspect posthumanism is a Superman fetish. The the post-human that the transhumanists of today imagine is not unlike the Superman trope of the 1930s. This imaginary of the post-human has arisen out of more than a century of a techno-utopian kind of culture and a lot of science fiction that you know, we've got a resurgence of interest in the Marvel comics and all this kind of thing. And Dana, we must have a conversation later about how this ties in with your hero imaginary. I think it's very relevant. But the Machine Institute, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which is one of the biggest institutes in the States researching all this stuff, says that even human equivalent general intelligence is still a science fiction. We're nowhere near reaching human equivalent general intelligence. As Richard said, that the AI that's being talked about is in a very narrow band at this point. It's really, you know, it's more rapid processing and calculation, essentially, and use of algorithms to kind of guess things. But it's nothing to do with even being anywhere near human formal operations, let alone post-formal reasoning, complexity, paradox, imagination, those kind of things. So really, these artificial superintelligence and post-humanism, they're very much as much science fiction as Superman ever was. And here's a couple of comparative images, the old Superman of the 30s and the augmented post-human imaginary of today with these sort of augmented robotic arms, being able to do a bit of a Mr. Smith in the Matrix kind of tough guy thing. So now the singularity concept has been around since at least 1950. It was talked about in conferences back in 1950. Ray Kurzweil has very much popularised this idea, and his idea is that our intelligence will become increasingly technological and trillions of times more powerful than it currently is. He has developed the Singularity, founded the Singularity University with Peter Diamandis to work on this, and his view is that this will come. He's saying by 2029, but that was actually that figure came out of a paper, scientific paper back in 1950. So it's not a new idea. One thing I found rather kind of interesting and ironic when I was doing this research was that the Singularity University, that's the Singularity University logo. Do we know what that is? I find it intriguing. I just leave it there as a question. Now we have Elon Musk's neural lace. So in some ways I have a lot of admiration for what Elon Musk is doing. I think he's done some fantastic things with the Tesla motor car, electric car idea, and although I'm not really big on space research, he's doing some great things there as well. When I say I'm not big on space research, I think that the research we need to do is more about inner space rather than outer space, because we're so far behind human beings in our research on inner space, psychological space, cultural space. But basically I find this fascinating what he says. It won't necessarily require brain surgery for implantation. Instead, the hardware could simply be injected into the jugular and travel through the brain, through the bloodstream. So these little digital components that they're coming up with can be injected through our jugular, if we want. So what's interesting though is this emerging field of brain-computer interface is now very popular in Silicon Valley. It's where all the research dollars now are going to develop superintelligence, deep mind and all these things. And what I discovered also, which I'm not saying much about here, but the US Defence Forces have decided to move their headquarters to Silicon Valley because they want to partner with the big money researchers in AI and so on to help them with developing the next iteration of autonomous weapons of war, lethal autonomous weapons of war, which is another whole subject I won't go into. Now, the second part of my presentation is about transhumanism, superhuman, and conscious evolution from a human-centred futures point of view. Transhumanism was, in the 20th century, a humanistic ideal. In 1950, Teilhard de Chardin published an article, From the Pre-Human to the Ultra-Human, The Phases of a Living Planet, in which he speaks of some sort of transhuman at the ultimate heart of things. This concept of ultra-human and transhuman, they were evolutionary concepts linked with humanistic and spiritual futures, not related to technology. In 1957, Julian Huxley wrote an article, Transhumanism, and this is the article that today's techno-transhumanists refer to as the article that coined the term. What they seem to overlook is Huxley, who was a biologist and humanitarian, he was the first Director General of UNESCO back in 1946. His transhumanism was inspired by Teilhard de Chardin, who was his friend. It was a spiritual humanism and based on his own evolutionary humanism. So Huxley also put forward the idea of planetary evolution. Dana talked about that as well, planetary consciousness. Edgar Morin, great French philosopher, talks about the planetary era, planetary consciousness. These are concepts that have emerged out of Teilhard de Chardin's notion of the planetization of mankind. It's a complete antithesis to what we have today as globalization. To diverge slightly, globalization is basically an economic and geopolitical movement, which has very little to do with culture. Teilhard de Chardin's planetization of mankind was basically a cultural integration, and he spoke about that instead of nations, his vision was instead of nations, we should have an efflorescence of cultures, which is a beautiful concept. So Huxley also promoted the idea of conscious evolution, which originated 200 years ago from the German Romantic philosopher Schelling and others, and it's re-emerging today. And I think, Eric, you're going to be talking about some transcendental issues which may be related to the German idealists and romantics, I suspect. Origins of Superman. The idea of human beings evolving superhuman powers is not new either. 1883, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the Übermensch, translated as superhuman, ultrahuman, higher person. His ideas were integrating Darwin's biological evolution with the German idealist's writings on evolution of consciousness and his own ideas on freedom. Then French philosopher Henri Bergson wrote in 1907 about the Superman, arising out of the human being in much the same way that humans have arisen from animals. In parallel with the work of Nietzsche and Bergson, Rudolf Steiner articulated his own ideas of the evolving human being, and he had concepts such as spirit self or spirit man, and he was writing in the early 20th century. During the same period as Steiner, Indian political activist and philosopher Sri Aurobindo was also writing in India about the overman, consciously evolving human being. And Sri Aurobindo's integral evolutionary work also drew from the German idealists as well as the ancient Hindu texts. Both Steiner and Aurobindo founded education systems to try to develop these characteristics in human beings using the Bildung style of holistic human development. That's the German concept of education, which was how mass education or universal education actually began. It didn't begin as a factory model. It began as a concept based on the evolution of human beings put forward by the German idealists, and the Bildung meant the full whole development of the human being. And that's what the origins of universal education were about, when they began, before they were sort of hijacked by the Industrial Revolution. Now I'm being given the move on, so I'll move more quickly. So conscious evolution, there are three domains of what I call conscious evolution. The adult developmental psychology research, the cultural evolution research, and the research on the future of the body, if you like, futures of the body. So Jean Piaget, developmental psychologist, came up with the notion of 4 stages of human development. The fourth being formal operations or formal logic, which he said was developed at late adolescence, early adulthood. It's the kind of logic that, if we speak from a cultural perspective, the Greek philosophers were developing in Athens in the sort of last millennium BCE. But what Piaget didn't do was talk about what happened after that. And he did point to it, but he didn't take it further. He did say, I've got a few quotes from him somewhere that he said, there must have been something more, but he didn't study it, he didn't get there. And his ideas were picked up by the adult developmental psychologists from the 70s, particularly in the US, and they developed a concept that they call post-formal reasoning. And that basically is a broad term used to describe the higher levels, higher types of reasoning, higher qualities of reasoning beyond formal operations, beyond binary logic. Keep in mind that the whole IT world is built on binary. So we're moving beyond binary. We're moving into complex post-formal reasoning. Now, you'll get a copy of this presentation or PowerPoint, so we don't need to go through all this, but these are qualities that have been identified by adult developmental psychologists as being qualities of higher functioning, mature adult thinkers. Complexity, creativity, futures reasoning, higher purpose, ecological thinking, reflexivity, pluralism. I've distilled all of their research into 12 qualities, the column on the left. But they're the kinds of thinking that we all, probably most of us, take for granted and expect in our own selves and in our colleagues and in our work that we read and enjoy and discuss. But this is all higher functioning. This is post-formal reasoning, and this is something that cannot be developed by machines augmenting our brains. It's something that we develop in ourselves through our consciousness. The second approach, second domain, is the cultural history research, and I use Jean Gebser, Swiss cultural historian, for this. He spoke of 5 developmental stages, if you like, throughout history, which he called mutations. Archaic was prehistory, magical, ice age, mythic, prior to the 3,000 years prior to the Greek cultural, philosophical and alphabetic and so on development. And then he talked about, from the Renaissance, the beginnings of what he called integral consciousness. And I equate the two, integral consciousness and post-formal reasoning, that in a sense, as a culture develops integral consciousness, the human beings in that culture are also developing post-formal reasoning, and the two nourish each other, if you like. So I've just done a little sort of an isomorphic parallel suggestion between these two, the development of the individual, which we can call ontogeny, and the development of culture, phylogeny. The idea that that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was a sort of boo-hooed last century, but it's actually, it needs to be looked at not as a black and white thing or not as a linear thing, but as a sort of parallel development. Now the last section here, conscious evolution, domain 3, the futures of the body research. Now Alethea spoke about and brought our attention to the importance of body, presence, embodiment, awareness. This is an important area, and we're in a sense kind of being hijacked by technology in that way. I mean, particularly if we allow ourselves to be implanted with all sorts of things, unless we've lost a leg and we need an artificial leg. I think there's a certain justification for that. But having little digital things shot into your jugular, well, is not my idea of futures. So Michael Murphy, who was a founder of Esalen Institute, he has spent 40 years researching the superhuman powers of human beings, nothing to do with technological augmentation. He's got over 10,000 case studies, and they draw on people as broadly as Catholic mystics, Sufis, ecstatics, Hindu-Buddhist siddhis, martial arts practitioners, elites, athletes, and so on. And he refers to the idea of these human beings who are advancing the capabilities of the physical body. They're developing the limbs and organs of our evolving human nature. So, in summary, we're at a critical point in research into human futures. Two divergent streams show up in the human futures conversations. Which direction we choose will also decide the fate of Earth futures, at least in the sense of Earth's dual role as home for humans and habitat for life in general. So I have a little sort of distillation of what I consider these two extremes to be. Human-centred futures, in my view, is humanitarian, philosophical and ecological. It's based on a view of humans as kind, fair, consciously evolving, peaceful agents of change with a responsibility to maintain the ecological balance between humans, Earth and cosmos. Human-centred futures involve ongoing psychological, socio-cultural, aesthetic and spiritual development, and a commitment to the betterment of earthly conditions for all humanity through, not technological enhancement or genetic manipulation, but through education, cultural diversity, greater economic and resource parity, and respect for future generations. Technotopian futures, and I can be called a propagandist of human futures if you like, but I'm unashamedly normative in this respect. What I call technotopian futures is dehumanising, scientistic and atomistic. It is based on a mechanistic behaviourist model of the human being, drawing on the machine, man as machine, and behaviourist psychology and so on, and the thin cybernetic view of intelligence. The transhumanist ambition to create future techno-humans, in my view, is anti-human and anti-evolutionary. Jim Data doesn't agree with me. That's okay. We're a broad church in the World Future Studies Federation. It involves technological, biological and genetic enhancement of humans and artificial and machine intelligence. Some technotopians have transcendental dreams of abandoning Earth to build a fantasised techno-heaven on Mars or in satellite cities in outer space. And some of us have said, like Natalie said, that she had resisted that side of things, and I have as well. I would rather see us attend to the issues we have on Earth than run away from Earth and start all the same things. I'm sure we'd have the same problems on Mars that we have here, unless we solve them here first. So, and Eric, by mentioning the word transcendental dreams, it's a kind of a segue into you. So, a paradoxical ending. Because from a post-formal viewpoint, I can't just say, well, there's either or human futures or techno futures. That would be a binary logic, and I'm not going to be caught in that. So from a post-formal viewpoint, it can't be simply black and white, either or. So it's always mixed, and particularly now in the 21st century, because we've had sort of very invasive technologies for a long time. I'm giving this talk with a microphone, with a computer. You know, I flew here from Australia, etc., etc. But the crucial questions are, who is in charge? Who is in charge? Who is in charge of futures? Is it humans? Is it us? Is it a pluralistic democracy of humans? Is it the oligarchs in Silicon Valley? Is it me or my machine? I saw an example the other day. If you say when your phone is running out of battery, I'm running out of battery, it's too late. It's your phone that's running out of battery, not you. Is it the people or the robots that are in charge? Is it artificial intelligence or is it human wisdom? Because we can't create, I don't think we can create machine wisdom. We might be able to create machine intelligence of some kind, depending how you define intelligence. I think wisdom is for the domain of the humans and the gods, if there are such things. So, thank you.